Paula. Hi, everyone. My name's Lisa LaRue, and I'm a COP lead for the SVRI Faith and GBV Community of Practice. And we're doing the second webinar in our Faith and PBK series. And this webinar is called Unearthing What We Know, Identifying and Collecting Practice-Based Knowledge. Now, in this PBK Faith and Violence Against Women and Children series is based on what we learned during year one from COP members, and seeing how much learning there is amongst COP members about working and being at this intersection between faith and GBV. So we have this PBK initiative running now in year two, which is this webinar series. And then we're going to do some further activity supporting certain COP members in producing COP outputs. So in October, we did the first webinar in the series, which was a simple, basic introduction to PBK and an opportunity for us to discuss and share its importance of practice-based knowledge at the intersection of faith and violence against women and children. And I will paste the link to that webinar recording in the chat for those who don't have it. Next slide, please, Paula. So just some quick housekeeping. Please introduce yourself in the chat. We are recording, so if you're not comfortable being recorded, just keep your video off. A big part of this PBK series is that people watch the recordings afterwards. So it is going to be on SVRI's website and on SVRI's YouTube channel. Use the chat box, please, for comments and questions. And if your bandwidth allows, please keep your video on because it's just nice seeing all of you. Next slide, please. So today, with our next step in our PBK series, we're looking at how we identify and collect practice-based knowledge. So last time we spoke about how we all have it, but now we're focusing more on how do we actually identify what it is that we and our organizations know, and how do we collect that practice-based knowledge. And I have two amazing guest speakers joining me today in discussing this. Lejla Ramovic of Justice for Women, and then Sister Mūmbi Kīgūtha of Friends for Solidarity, Watawa and Kuibuka, and they will share with us about their organizations. But they will especially share with us their experiences of using stories and arts to identify and collect practice-based knowledge. Now, Sister Mūmbi, she was born and raised in Kenya, but she's currently living in the US. And she ministers as full-time president of Friends in Solidarity, which is a nonprofit that supports development efforts in South Sudan. She's also the director of Watawa, which is an initiative aimed at reimagining and revitalizing religious life for African women. And she's also co-director of Kuibuka, which is a project that offers workshops for African sisters on sexual and spiritual abuse. Then Lejla, she is founder and director of Justice for Women. She was born in Sarajevo, but she currently resides in Amsterdam, where she also grew up. And she has a passionate commitment to human rights. And that's been a common thread in all of her life, throughout her studies and her career, where she's working full-time, but also running Justice for Women full-time. Thank you so much to both of you for being here today and being willing to share with us. Now, before we hear more from our speakers, I want us to just go back to where we ended our first webinar. Next slide, please, Paula. So like I said, in our October webinar, we explored what practice-based knowledge is. So you can look at your screen, but to remind ourselves, PBK is cumulative knowledge and learning acquired by practitioners through years of innovation, reflection, and refinement. And it includes insights from observations, conversations, experience, direct experience, and program monitoring. So in that session's reflections, it hopefully became clear to all of us that those of us working on the ground in communities and who engage directly with those whom the programs are intended to benefit are carriers of practice-based knowledge, but also those of us directly affected, so survivors and their families and those supporting them. We all have very valuable practice-based knowledge, which is so important for understanding the complexities of the intersection between faith and violence against women and children. So these insights and knowledge really should be captured, but not just captured, also shared. Next slide, please. So we sometimes struggle to share our practice-based knowledge because we struggle to actually identify our own knowledge, our own practice-based knowledge, and the PBK that's emerging as we do what we do, as we live our lives. So because of that, I think it can be useful for us to cover what I kind of call 4 key tips or clues for identifying PBK. So this is about learning to recognize, like when you read about people in the olden days when they were looking for gold in the river, to kind of know where are the places, the corner of the river where I don't know, I've never done this, where the gold dams up or something, and how to move that basket thingy so that they can actually see the gold. So this is what we're looking for. How do we recognize those nuggets of PBK, of insight that's hidden in our everyday work and I think sometimes just hidden in our minds? We often feel unsure about what it is that we know. Is this actually PBK? So what we're covering here is 4 areas in which we see PBK, or 4 clues for where to find PBK. So next slide, please, Paula. So the first one is moments of change. So a way to identify PBK is by asking yourself, when did something shift? When did something change? So, for example, maybe a faith leader was resistant to any talk about violence against women and girls, and then suddenly started to speak out publicly during sermons, to speak out publicly against violence against women and girls. Or maybe a women's organization tried a new activity, and then suddenly more men in the community started taking part in their activities. So there's a key shift, a key change. And these moments of change are indicators that some kind of knowledge is at work. Something caused that shift. So where you see something changing, that is a good space to go and dig into and figure out, why did those changes happen? And then when you figure that out, that's good PBK. So the second clue is patterns, and patterns of experience. So if you see patterns emerging, so something happens and it happens again. So for example, you may have different teams in your organization working in different places, but they report similar experiences. So you see a pattern. Like, for example, they see that the scriptural reflections, the sessions on scriptural reflections always continue almost double the time, and people are always eager to talk more. That's a pattern. So patterns are often where PBK lives. So these repeated, consistent experiences that reveal to us what tends to work, but also what doesn't work. Then the third clue is workaround and adaptation. So pay attention to the adaptations people make to get things done. So for example, you may have a standardized curriculum that you use when you work with faith leaders on FGMC. But you realize that almost all of your facilitators make adjustments to the third section of the curriculum, which is on healthy sexuality. I'm like making all of this up. So to ask yourself, why are they making those adjustments? Why is everyone making? So there's a pattern, yes, but it's a pattern specifically around adaptations and workarounds. Why are they changing it? How are they changing it? So both in the why and the how, there is PBK. And often very important insights around contextual relevance and about implementation realities. Then the fourth clue. A fourth space where we find PBK is when people try to make sense of what they're experiencing. So, you know, when you're with someone and they say they just finished a project or they just finished a seminar or a workshop and they say, oh my goodness, I don't know how we actually pulled that off. That is a space to stop and listen and to ask them, so how were you able to pull that off? So PBK is often embedded in reflection. So when people make sense of their own experiences, not just sharing what happened, which is important, but trying to make sense of that. Why did it happen that way? So if you can create spaces where people reflect, you can actively source PBK in such a way. And this again highlights the importance of the PBK of survivors. Their reflections on their lived experiences is an invaluable source of PBK. Okay, so to summarize the 4 clues or 4 areas, when you hear people describe turning points, patterns, adaptations, or their reflections, that's a signal that PBK is being shared. Even if they're not calling it PBK, you put on your PBK ears then. Next slide, please. So if we now have some idea with these clues around where to go and find your organization's PBK or your community's PBK, how do we go about collecting it? Because remember, we want to be able to share our practice-based knowledge, but first we have to gather it. So I think by default, many of us feel like we need official researchers to do it. So people from outside who come in and they do interviews and focus groups and surveys, and then they tell us what the PBK is. It can, of course, be done that way. It's not wrong, but it's not the only way. And it's great that it's not the only way, because not all of us have the money or the infrastructure to bring in external people. So before we go to our 2 speakers, I want to share 5 practical ways in which you, in your everyday life and in your everyday work, can go about collecting PBK so that others can learn from it without that collection process feeling like a formal research project. Okay, next slide, please. Storytelling. Stories are one of the richest ways to capture lived experiences. And especially if you ask for stories and listen for stories of change, what people did, what they learned, what surprised them. So, and you can use prompts like, what's something that worked better than you expected? Or what did you learn when that didn't go as you planned? And then you record these stories or you write them down. They really are full of embedded knowledge. Second one is reflective discussions or learning circles. So this is where you bring people together for a short reflective session, like 30 minutes. At the end of an activity, you maybe have a community workshop, and then afterwards just ask people, can you stay for 30 minutes? And you debrief with them. 15 minutes, you debrief with them the workshop and how it was experienced. Like what worked, what didn't work. What did you notice from this, from how people interacted? What should we do differently next time? Then after action reviews, it's a bit like the previous one, but that's focused on the team during the implementation. So it's a quick structured reflection immediately after an event or an activity. So the classic 4 questions are, what was supposed to happen? what actually happened, why was there a difference, what can we learn for next time. So it's a practical way of getting those practical insights while they're still fresh. Then peer exchanges and mentoring. Some people just share their best learning and lessons when it's being done informally. So you're having tea, or you're driving somewhere together, or you're walking somewhere together. And you can turn these moments into a knowledge capture opportunity simply by making notes of key takeaways, or afterwards that evening making notes of key takeaways, or maybe recording short voice notes for yourself, of course, just with consent. So, and then later these can be synthesized into short briefs or learning notes. And that brings us to the last point. It can be very helpful to, for yourself, develop a template which you complete regularly. So it doesn't need to be hectic. It can be like a one-page document with 5 questions. Like, what did we try? What did we learn? What's the advice we'd give others? But that we actually write down, or if you're not much of a writer, you can make voice recordings for yourself, but that we regularly and make a practice of capturing these learnings. Okay, so I've been saying a lot, but what I'm hoping that you're seeing is that identifying and collecting PBK does not have to be this strenuous additional research activity. Rather, it can be part of a continuous process of monitoring and of reflecting on what you're doing. And it doesn't need formal research processes or formally trained researchers. You don't need to do formal interviews or focus group discussions. In different spaces and places, you just need to listen and make notes or make recordings. As you can see, many of these methods are not new. They're things you do in your organization as part of your everyday doing what you do. All that it asks of you is to notice and listen slightly differently, and then document in whatever way works for you. You document what you're hearing. So now, next slide, please. We're going to turn to our speakers who have been doing this in practice in amazing ways and creative ways. And I'm hoping what you will see today is it's not just about writing stuff down with a pen and paper and, putting it in a report. There are such amazing ways that we can collect PBK. Yes. So, Sister Mūmbi, I'm going to turn to you first. Thank you so much again for being with us today. To start, maybe, can you share briefly with us what Watawa is and what inspired its work? Please.
Thank you. Watawa means consecrated women of light or sisters of light. And the tag that goes along with the name, reimagining and revitalizing religious life for African women, is really what we try to do. Watawa came out of many conversations I'd had with other African sisters randomly, with nothing really. When you meet, you talk about the things that are common to us. And a realization after especially living in the US and engaging with sisters here, that religious life in Africa evolved very differently. One of the things is that when Vatican II was happening, which was like the big moment of reformation for many congregations, we were going through our independence struggles in Africa. And due to a lack of technological infrastructure, we weren't following the happenings of Vatican II as sisters in the West were doing. So, and then many congregations were also just newer, coming into their being as congregations. So where they were as congregations of sisters was not where many other older congregations were. And after doing theology and doing a lot of decolonial thought, I started wondering, what would it look like if we chose this life for ourselves in a new way? Looking at the essentials of religious life that are standard across the world, but also asking, how do these intersect with African reality, African culture? So this is how it came about. It was a thought. Then I shared this thought with somebody else who happened to have the kind of connections and financial resources to say, this is something worth investigating further. And in a conversation with her, she introduced a new aspect I hadn't thought about. So my thought was gather sisters from across Africa of different language groups and have these conversations on the essentials of religious life. Sisters of different congregations, of different ages, of different educational backgrounds. But she brought in another aspect and said, what if we could tell the stories of sisters who had served longer in religious life in Africa, the so-called pioneers, because their reality is very different from the younger cohort, and have them theologically reflect again on these same essentials of religious life and how they have evolved in their understanding and practice of them. And so Living Ancestors was born out of that. So what we do are two different initiatives. We have about 210 sisters in 16 African countries who gather monthly for 3-hour discussions. And they could be talking about the vows they stand, they could be talking about leadership, they could be talking about formation or community life. And as they have these conversations with guided questions, they record these conversations. So there was a lot of consent planning, etc. before. And the facilitators who we trained by gathering them in Nairobi in person at the beginning of this project also use templates to quickly jot down at the end of every 3-hour session what has really stood out in this whole conversation. So we churn that information at the end of the year and a manual will come out of it. But in Living Ancestors, we send prompts to sisters who get to write their stories in their own words. And that's the other piece of Watawa. Thank you.
Wow. I'm really very curious because as you explain, I mean, there's so many conversations happening with so many women in such different places. And I was wondering, like, when you listen to that, and I mean, those are long sessions that you're having, how do you begin to recognize when those experiences hold important learning or wisdom? What we now call practice-based knowledge, but kind of there's a lot there. How do you recognize that, oh, wait, we need to pay attention to this kind of, please?
I think the main thing is patterns. I'm a sister myself, and the people who work on me in this project are largely sisters. And I remember when we said getting the first information, the recordings, we listened to it, we transcribed it raw as it was. And we started seeing patterns of resonance, of disruption, of shifts. I mean, when you're immersed in the culture, you're also noticing the narratives are changing. There's something happening here based on what I've had over and over again. I've been living this life for almost 20 years now. So you notice the shift that has come in how people are telling the story. But you also hear it when stories carry strong emotion, or they're stories of silence or courage. And this for me point to communal wisdom. Finally, sisters across congregations, if you know anything about African religious life, many congregations of sisters are still very large. And so they work in their own institutions. So I would say they're very siloed. And then across Africa, because of colonial languages, we are unable to interact. So we have groups that are French speaking, we have groups that are Portuguese speaking. So they have not been interacting. So when you start seeing patterns emerging from all these contexts, then you know something is shifting, something is happening. Or even the sisters themselves will say, I never had a chance to think about this. If I was to be asked, we could do this differently. So this is how we start recognizing this. And you also feel that there's a response demanded. When an experience shifts how, sisters see themselves or they see God, and they say, and they claim it, and they say, this is our life, or no one has ever asked me this before, then you know something is happening there. And allow me to theologize. I believe this is sacred ground. When you encounter that, you're really entering into the lived experiences of people, and they're allowing you to see their vulnerabilities play out. And because the stories are not always of what should change or what should shift, what emerges naturally are also times of struggle and times of pain and times of trauma, and how they have made meaning of this and come out on the other side and recommitted anew to living this life.
Oh my goodness. You're saying so many things that just really resonates, and also it was just so striking to me how you highlighted how siloed we've been because of our colonial histories on the continent, and how these conversations, how important it is, how that we are bridging those divides by sharing, and how empowering that can be. But at the same time, I'm also hearing the responsibility. There's a responsibility when you take on this role. It can be heavy, and it should not be taken lightly. I think maybe that's, yeah. Thank you so much. Now I'm maybe getting a bit more practical, and I do want to ask if you can somewhere during our session share the link to the book that they have published, and it's going to come out in different languages, of sisters and their stories. Is a free ebook. It's amazing. So I do want her to share the link. I am wondering, how do you go about collecting and recording? So very practically, how do you do this? It's so much, but also doing it in a way that is respectful and I think honors what's being shared. These are serious conversations. Please.
It was very important for me, especially the conversations that are happening across the 16 countries in 21 groups, are for it to really be grounded in empirical evidence. If we are going to share this knowledge with sisters in leadership, sisters in formation, sisters who have the authority to shift how we do certain practices, it needs to be backed by empirical evidence. So that part was grounded in getting the facilitators to come to Nairobi, to get to know me, to get to know why we are doing this, to get to know that we are going to honor them and we are not trying to engage in exploitative practices. And so we spent a lot of time in conversation. We spent a lot of time talking about how to do focus group discussions in a way that is not power hierarchical, but you facilitate just bringing out the conversation. And then we spent a lot of time doing a lot of paperwork, writing letters to the participants that were going to recruit, explaining who we are, seeking their consent, seeking their permission to use their material. And I know this is a challenge we have in Africa. For a long time, people have extracted information from Africa without getting consent and published it in places that are far away from the sisters. So in between the 1 year, this was a 1 year process when we did it the first time. We are starting it again this month for the second time, was communicating constantly with the facilitators and being available to answer questions as they emerge. It was a new experience for us. It was a new experience for them. So honoring that is so important. So some of the groups meet by Zoom. They record the conversation. Some of them meet in person, and we provided little recorders. The work of the facilitator is to facilitate and just do like a 1-page summary at the end of it. They send us the raw material. And then it was literally the bare bones, sitting and first listening and writing reflexive notes, a team of 3 sisters. It was difficult, but we had to do it. And then I also crunched some of that data through qualitative analytical tool, Maxada. Some of you might be familiar with it. But then I also got somebody who was not an African sister to look at that again and see what was emerging for her as a laywoman in the US, looking at African material. And so out of all this is when we started drawing these threads. What I did not want was a summary, and that manual of what we gathered is coming out by the end of this year. I did not want it to be academically heavy. This needs to go back to the sisters to say, oh, this is coming up in many places. So despite the bigger manual, we have also done a 3-page summary of each month's conversations, like a little brochure that you can pick up and say, what are sisters saying about the vows? What are sisters saying about community life? And what is also very important to us has been making this free of charge and publishing them trilingually, Portuguese, French, and English, the three main languages on the continent, so that any sister can access them. And that is why they are e-resources, because when you start thinking again of the infrastructure, logistics of trying to get material to bookshops across Africa, it would be almost impossible to do. Yes, so I hope I've answered your question, Lisa.
Yes, and just in the process, so many new questions are emerging. But something that struck me when you were saying this is how reflexive the process is. Again and again and again, you're engaging with what you're hearing, but it's not an extractive process. Also, what you're learning is always going back. And I think something that also stood out for me is, I mean, what you're describing and how you engage with the data and engage in a qualitative analysis process at one of the steps. We often with PBK think, oh, okay, so there's proper research, formal research, and then there's PBK. But our engagement with practice-based knowledge can be very systematic and use these methods from proper research. So it's not a total separation and, oh, with PBK, we just randomly write it up. There can, be proper processes behind that as well. Sister Rumi, oh, sorry. I am wondering, how did you invite and collect the stories? Now, you shared a lot about that, but these sisters that took part, the Wisdom Sisters, how did you get them to take part?
Lots of phone calls, lots of conversations. Almost to a T, everybody I reached out to said, I'm not an author. I've never written anything. Africa so far, and this is not to disparage Africa, we are very relational. So emails do not work. Blind, cold emails to individuals do not work in getting the best responses. And I find that our communities as sisters are still quite close to this kind of engagement with the outer world. But there's also a lot of about respecting your congregation, getting the necessary permissions to do this kind of work. So I was a stranger. They would see an email from me, they wouldn't respond. So WhatsApp numbers are very important when working in Africa, and doing voice notes and calling and just reassuring them that we're not going to publish anything while it's still raw. There'll be a back and forth from you. But snowballing, it was really reaching out to the sisters I knew and saying, do you know sisters who have had more than 30 years in religious life who you think would be willing to tell their stories? And this fast phase was, I have to say, it was hard. It took almost 18 months to just get 16 stories. Some withdrew consent, so you'll see the final book is 15 stories. And it's then working with them. They write the first draft, send it back to them, ask, could you develop this part more? And assuring them that no grammatically incorrect work will go out. So that back and forth. However, I have to say, I think everything starts this way, because now that we have gotten the first book out, we have already received 4 stories and so many others are eager to participate. So the marketing cycle, there are always early adopters who come on when it's still mysterious and they're not sure what are the consequences of risking my story and putting it out there. But now others have seen how empowering it is, and others are asking to do this. So I'm blessed because I do get to travel and meet sisters in different places. So I'm always pitching. I have to say and my background is marketing, so maybe it's not so hard for me. But whenever I meet them, I have these little brochures and I keep giving them and pitching this and saying, please do this. Will you please write this? And then there's lots of follow-up. So this is just the context and you have to adapt to it. And so sisters had about it, sisters recommended others. And through Kuibuka, when we do the safeguarding workshops, I get to meet lots of congregational leaders and I would say, do you have sisters that you could encourage to write? And maybe for some, it came from their authority figure, but it has turned out to be a very life-giving experience. So this is how we arrived here. And I have to just say, you want to work in Africa, you work on the relationships first before you do the asks of what you need. Yes.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Sister Mūmbi. I feel I could keep on asking questions forever, but I am conscious of time. So I'm going to move over to Lejla. Lejla, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Lejla, your organization, Justice for Women, you use art to capture and share the stories of survivors with the aim of, and these are now my words, you can totally change it if I capture it incorrectly, but with the aim of achieving societal change. So change in how people understand sexual violence and how they understand survivors and their needs. Now, Lejla, I'm very excited for you to share a bit more with us about the art project, because it's a totally different way around capturing survivors and their experiences and their practice-based knowledge. So maybe first of all, what inspired you to listen to survivors and capture their stories in this way, in this arts-based way? But you need to tell us a bit more about the art as well.
Yeah,
Please.
I will tell you a bit more about that. Well, it's quite simple. I was born in Bosnia, and after 95, like these stories got out about women being systematically raped within a war. And I thought, wow, I grew up in a country like in Europe, like how is this possible? And what does that mean? I know murder, I know camps, I know a lot of things, but I've never heard about that many women being raped. And I was from a country that, had to suffer those injustices. And I thought, okay, what is that even mean? And so I turned to knowledge that I knew existed at that point because I was studying. So I turned to university and I tried to find articles about it, just to try to to even try to understand what happened even in my country. And then I couldn't not find pretty much any answers. Definitely not. I could find reports about how many women were raped and where and how and stuff like that, but nothing else. And what inspired me to even turn to art, because I went to and even speak to survivors. I went to my country and I spoke to a certain woman who already started to run such organization. And I said, just please try to explain to me what it is. And then I started to listen to those women, and I started to understand how survivors carry so much form of knowledge that is totally absent, like from any formal achievement, academic work, or like political debates. Their memories, emotions, and embodied experience hold layers of truth that just cannot be captured by reports or legal documents. It's just like information that you always find there. And in every conflict, the world tends to talk about survivors, but like almost never with them and almost never through them. And with you, I just wanted to create that space where their voices are heard and not reduced to like an evidence in the court or testimony, but just like recognized as a form of wisdom, resilience, imagination, and resistance. The women actually just absolutely around the world. And I just wanted to make sure that came through my artwork. And, many survivors just live with immense silence when this happens to them, because because of the shame and taboo and of the fear that their stories will be misunderstood or simply dismissed because they're just not important enough. And that silence just becomes its own wound and trauma that they have to live for the rest of their life with. And so the inspiration just came from listening, truly listening, and understanding that survivors don't recount what happened to them. They also know what is the best way to continue, how they heal, how they make sense of the world that tries to erase them. And I think that voice deserves to be heard, and it also deserves to be placed in artistic piece that the whole world can listen to it. So that's how the project came, simply, to make a space for survivors' knowledge to exist with dignity, complexity, and all its beauty and all its pain, and not, to have, like I said, a report or something else for this, to listen to.
Oh, you said something so beautiful about survivors, that their voices are there not as evidence, like in a court, but as a source of wisdom. And I think
Yes,
what I very much appreciate about what you're highlighting is survivors as sources of wisdom about what they need and how it should be done, not just as places that need, as persons that need help, that need support, but
exactly.
that it's a different approach. But for those who've never seen your art and not been on the website, I think it can be very helpful if you tell us just a bit more about the artwork and how viewers engage with it, and then later if you can post the link as well. But please
Yes,
tell
I
us a
will.
bit about it, Lejla.
Well, it's a immersed landscape, you know. It's called Hue, and it's physically you can see it in a museum, hopefully, and you can see it also online, digitally. And it is like you enter in a digital world full with different islands. And when you land on an island, you hear the voices of survivors, their stories of what they have been through, sexual violence in war and genocide, and uh, afterwards, we're going to place it in hopefully many museums all over the world, and you can place it in any space. You can also watch, and I think especially for young generation to learn about these crimes, it's very important to have also VR element in it, and that's what we also try to do. And what I'm trying to do with this artwork is not to have a traditional artwork, you simply look at it. But when you hear the stories of those survivors, it's like you enter environment, and you enter it emotionally and with all your senses. You can see it, you can hear it, and the installation is just like so visual and symbolic with different elements of memory, resilience, and healing. And then visitors just walk to this space where testimonies are transferred in these beautiful visual sculptures of their memories, where they felt safe to tell their stories. And I hope it's like the many feel like the taboo and shame that we place on the survivors. Once you listen to those voices and to their stories, you feel you don't have to, society doesn't have to blame them anymore, but it shifts that blame and silence to those who to the perpetrators and the whole society who actually impose those silence to them. And that's what I'm actually hoping for, that shift will finally take place in our society that we live in, shifting the shame and to the people who actually did something terrible to those women, and not to those who had to endorse it and had to, build a whole life for themselves and for their families afterwards with all their trauma.
Thank you so much. And I placed the link in the chat. So please, everyone, I really do invite you to go and take time
Thank you.
to visit and really engage with the artwork and the stories that are being shared. I am wondering, I think what I really appreciate about the Who, if I pronounce it correctly, is
Yes, it is.
it it just so visually illustrates that we don't have to be stuck just in research reports, that we have different ways of communicating practice-based knowledge, and that those different ways of communicating communicates in different ways. It connects in very different ways. Now, I was wondering, in this process of turning someone's lived experiences, so the story that they shared, turning it into a part of the he, how do you ensure that their story and their meaning
Mm-hmm.
is preserved in the art and authentically preserved? So how do you kind of do that translation, that capturing, please?
It's quite that's quite easy. It's when I started when I learned about what happened in my country, I wanted to bring justice to those who had happened in some kind of way. And I thought, like, for me, it was like very then normal to go and study law. That's what I thought that I should do, because I thought that is the only way I can bring justice and healing to those survivors. And then I learned something quite new. I learned that survivors don't talk about things that are hurtful, that are shameful. And, even if you have a perfect legal system, it's not what they are looking for. And I learned that art can hold a very different form of truth, that, healing is just not linear. Justice is not always legal. And art just allows, very painful truth to exist in a way that honors all the complexity. It just shifts you away from being a survivor, from being a perpetrator. It opens up a space where you can just talk about what is happening, what happened, and how you can work to recognition. And through art, survivors reclaim their authority. They're not just survivors; they get to tell their story. They're not just an object. They're creating a meaning. They're telling their story. They are telling how they survived this, what helped them through. It's like you just feel. It's not politicalized anymore. It's not socialized. It's not emotionally avoidable when you enter this Pew project. And I think also, especially because of the shame, so many things have been hidden, and this is just like up there to see, to touch, to feel, but not in a vulnerable way. It's because of them, because they created a safely space where they can tell the story. It's about recognition. It's not it's just not about prosecution. It's about recognizing what happened to them, being listened to. You need to witness these stories. You need to carry those stories forward, and in a kind of collective memory, because that's what my country is left with. And usually these stories are never heard. Like I said, they are just mentioned in reports, in a court judgment, and you never hear the human side about what has happened. And art is just a medium, of expressing that. It's a vessel for knowledge, a quiet form of justice, different form of justice, and a, pathway, I hope, for, healing.
Oh, wow. I think you've already said, gone into this question, but maybe a last opportunity if you want to add. What have you learned in this process around how art can serve as a way of collecting and sharing knowledge about healing and justice? I think you've already, touched on this, but if you want to add something else, something more.
I think it's just quite easy because you enter a creative, more creative space, not a space, because when I try to collect stories, I never went to victims or survivors. It depends how you want to call them themselves. I wanted for them to feel safe. I only contact the biggest organization in Rwanda and Bosnia, and I asked them if they want to collaborate with me. So everything what happened was like total collaboration, co-creation, and consent between me and the survivors, and especially with, putting them in a safe space where they knew the organization. They already turned to the organization, so they get to play, they got a very safe space. They got to tell their stories in their own space, in their own way, how to tell them. And what I try to do is never to ask any questions to the survivors and tell them, please tell me what happened in the past to you. That I try to avoid. We began to, to approach it very differently. What they wanted to, it's like, how did you survive? What can, other people learn from you? What do you want to tell to other people who never told their stories? How can we, create space for other people who have been through traumas like you to open up about, what made you feel safe? What made you open up? And what you learn is that they want a very soft way of, they want to feel safe before they open up. They want to feel believed. They don't want to have to justify themselves. And, artwork just shifted away from like I'm a victim, or it's shifted away from I'm testifying, and it's just say that, okay, this is what I've been through and this is how I can help others, and this is how I'm going to build something, and this is my strength and not my weakness. And it was just like it took the art took us away from the war, it took us away from survivors, and it just placed them a very different role in the society. And
Lejla, thank you so much. I think, later on in the webinar series, we're going to talk more about dissemination, about how we actually capture PBK, and reports can be great, but also in other ways. But I think now with what you've been sharing already, highlighting to us how we can maybe challenge ourselves to think differently around how we share PBK for it to reach and connect in different ways. Because if I listen to this, is how this PBK collection process can actually become a healing process and a total reimagining process because of the arts methods that you bring in, which is just amazing to listen to. I'm going to immediately now, we're not a big group, which is actually lovely for these kinds of conversations. And if you're now listening to it on the YouTube recording, unfortunately, you can't ask questions. But I want to open it up to all of us in the room. If you have any questions to Sister Mūmbi or to Lejla, Susie, I've really appreciated what you've posted here on the side and in your own experiences, how art has helped your healing journey. But you also asked a specific question, and this was when Sister Mūmbi was sharing around how do you do this kind of work when the church doesn't want to facilitate it? And Susie, you can unmute yourself if you want to add to that question. And if you don't want to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, sorry.
No, you're fine. I really appreciate this conversation because I am working in this realm, and both in art and in facilitating change. So both of these speakers, it's resonated really profoundly with what I'm trying to do. So if your church doesn't want to facilitate this work and they're not doing it, and you're working outside of that, I've made a lot of connections within my own country, but then jumping over to other countries where I can connect with these women to create more conversations and dialogue in a safe way, because it's not safe in the church to speak about these things. And I'm not working against the church. I'm trying to work with the church to bring awareness in a way that it can be shown to leaders, which are all men, where they'll actually look at it. And so I want to bridge, we're a global church, and I want to reach out to women in other contexts, but I have to do it outside of the church networks in a way. So it's just complicated, and I haven't made that step yet. So yeah.
Sister Mūmbi, I was wondering if you can respond, because from the way I understood you weren't always going through those formal church networks either. If you can maybe share a bit from your experience.
I think it's lots of conversations. I mean, I hear so much resonance. I also belong to a very hierarchical, patriarchal church, yes. And I think some things are true of many religious institutions: the culture of silence, let's not air our dirty linen in public, etc. And these are difficult conversations to have. And especially speaking more about when I do Kuibuka work, which is about safeguarding sisters, and we're talking about spiritual and sexual abuse. It's really those, you meet one person and you talk to them and they introduce you to another person. I doubt if I ever send out a memo saying, please through the official channels, I would get much response. So it is, I scour the net, and I always say there's that moment when things shift. You meet the right person who can introduce you to 5 others. It's painstaking work, yes? And when I saw from your chat that you're working with the Church of Latter-day Saints that is growing rapidly in Africa, part of it starts with awareness raising. So, for instance, the issue of spiritual abuse, and sorry, Lisa, to go into a different area, the issue of spiritual abuse, we don't even have the right language for it yet, even recognizing it, because so much of it is tied into theological language. So we have normalized suffering because it's redemptive, because it's there in our story as Christians. So it's first of all raising that awareness that this is the true understanding, for instance, about obedience. This is the right way, and this is not. This is coercive and this is manipulative. When people then come into this awareness that, oh, what I've normalized as part of the whole package of maybe being a religious sister is not supposed to be normalized, and some of these things are distorted meanings, that starts opening doors, because they become your advocates, and they start telling the people, this is not normal. Even though we've been doing it for 3 generations, there's a distortion that happened at some point. They become your allies, they become your advocates, they introduce you to other people. I can also, and you have to understand the context and how communication happens in every context. America is a high language culture. You send an email, you get a response, sometimes even in 5 minutes. I've not put off my computer and I have a response. It's not the same in other parts of the world. So learning that and using whatever tool works there. I always think if I hadn't met my facilitators in the flesh and we spent 4 days together in Nairobi, I would not be where I am, because they got to know me. They got to test me out and see, am I consistent? What I say, my behavior, am I the person I claim to be? Yes. Sorry, let me add on. The support, you have to ask yourself also, what kind of support are you looking for? Some of the support-like resources will come outside of your church structures. There are groups and organizations committed to this kind of work. And I always say, when you provide empirical evidence, they'll no longer be able to keep quiet about it. And we saw that shift in our own Catholic Church. For years, reports had been taken to Rome. And finally, Pope Francis said, I think there's an issue with how sisters are being treated. And more recently, Pope Leo has given an interview, and he spoke and he mentioned the name of a friend of mine who was a whistleblower, and said, I read her story and that opened things. So it has taken more than 30 years in the Catholic Church for an acknowledgement that sisters do face spiritual and sexual harm, for that realization to come. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sister Mūmbi, for responding. And I'm now conscious of time, so I'm going to bring this to a close, but a couple of things and random things. I think, Lejla and Sister Mūmbi, it's just been so incredible what you have highlighted to us through what you've shared around the incredible knowledge and learning there is just from people living their lives at this intersection, you know. Thank you for also sharing the creative ways in which you've identified and collected, and I just really appreciate that. It feels like the most horrible abrupt ending now, but we're out of time. So I want to encourage everyone and anyone to reach out. If you want to chat with Lejla or with Sister Mūmbi, you can send an email to me and I'll put you in contact. And in our last 2 webinars, we're going to be talking more and more about these different creative ways of capturing and disseminating our practice-based knowledge. I'm hoping that you take from this really that identifying and collecting PBK can be done by anyone, and it can be done in incredibly creative ways that communicate in and connect in such amazing ways. Our next webinar will be in January of next year. So please watch your inbox, your emails for the invitation. And then we're going to be focusing on how do we collate and analyze and document in different ways our PBK. Again, Lejla and Sister Mūmbi, this was amazing. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you sharing all of this. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thank you.